everyone, and welcome to the With Love Nyasha podcast. I am your host, Nyasha Marian, and here on the show, our goal is to share ideas and experiences as a way to help you own your creative essence and find healing as you embrace your essence. Today, I have a special guest. Her name is Ash Kilback. Ash Kilback is a writer, poet, and creator of the art of paying attention, a slow-living community that weaves poetry, spiritual wisdom, and mindfulness practices together to help people cultivate a life rooted in presence. Her creative work is inspired by themes relating to nature, spirituality, womanhood, and current events that shape the narrative of our time. She is currently working on her debut poetry collection, exciting. So you can find her on Instagram. I will put the link in the show notes, and you can subscribe to The Art of Paying Attention, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Ash, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining me.
I'm doing well, Nyasha.
Hey.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to see what conversational journey you and I are going to go on together today.
Yes, it's literally just like our regular convos, just more to help other people if they need a little boost here and there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my first question for you would be, how would you describe poetic thought?
It's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
Poetic thought to me is very much about paying attention. And I think that is the work of all creatives and all artists in the world, always, I think, across time, right? Is that to be an artist, what it means is to pay deep attention to the world that's happening around us, to our own inner world that's happening within us. And to make these invisible connections that not a lot of people see, right? So it is the experience, and it's this process of how do I go out in the world and look at something deeply in a way that not a lot of people look at it. Okay. So an example that's coming to mind for me right now is like, think of a tree. There was a conversation that's coming to mind where somebody said once that, you know, oftentimes we have these things in our ordinary days that we actually have never really looked at.
Yeah.
So true. Say if you have a tree in your backyard right now, how many times have you really actually looked at that tree? Came to know the characteristics of the tree, what kind of being that tree is, what it makes you feel, what it makes you think of, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the work of the artist is looking at that tree.
That's good.
And we can say that as to, looking at the baby that's peering over the mother's shoulder when you're sitting in the coffee shop. Mm-hmm. It's looking at the person that's, crossing the crosswalk while you're in traffic. Yes. It's looking at the clouds in the sky. It's listening and being deeply observant and attentive, I think. And taking these very ordinary moments that we don't think are magical.
Yes.
Or have meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And we find the extraordinary in those ordinary moments. Mm-hmm. And by way of doing that, the work of the artist is to remind people of life.
I love that.
Yeah.
I really love that. And I love that you even touched on the tree, because fun fact, we actually have 2 trees in the back. You didn't know that, though.
I didn't know that, no.
Yes, we have 2 trees in the back. And what you shared reminds me of a moment where I was walking home I took the bus to the university. So I was walking home, and it was early fall, like it was still warm outside, not cold yet. Mm-hmm. And the sun was shining. I remember just seeing all these brown leaves just on the sidewalk. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then the wind came, and I laughed so hard because when the wind blew the leaves, they looked like they were running. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow. And in that moment, I just felt so almost like energized or charged, or I guess you could say refreshed, right? So even as you're talking, I feel like even something to add to poetic thought is sometimes we underestimate how life-giving it can be for our spirit or our soul, you know what I mean? Because literally I looked at that and I was like, oh my God, I need to write something, because that looked so funny, because anyone else driving around just sees leaves blowing, but it literally looked like little like creatures, like not creepy looking creatures, but literally the leaves looked like they were running. And I thought to myself, I said, wow, imagine if the wind didn't blow them, they would have stayed exactly where they were. And I feel like sometimes when we're walking in our essence, we find ourselves in spaces where it's like, well, I'm doing the thing, I'm writing the stories, and then something in life comes and it's like, let me just push you. And it looks like you're running, and then you find yourself sometimes resisting, because that was me literally 2 weeks ago. So I was like, oh, as you're sharing that, I'm like, that is so beautiful, because I think sometimes we really do underestimate just enjoying or getting some kind of like energy or just pure joy out of the simple things that are around us, TV is great, don't get me wrong, TV is amazing. I get inspired by different shows, but I think even just watching nature goes a long way. So I really love that you shared that.
Presence.
Yes.
Right? Of just allowing ourselves to just be with what is here in front of us.
Yes. 100%.
And seeing the magic that's always available to us in any moment, right?
Yes. That's amazing. And it really is. So I guess my next question for you, this one I was like, I really want to know this. Have you ever started a piece and had to let it go?
I find that yes and no in the same sense. In that I recently, this was earlier this year, where I think it's letting go of what you hope the piece to be.
That's good.
So I wrote this piece about this. I was walking with my dad, and we were on a walk together, and I was sharing with him about something really interesting that I had saw, and it kind of got us talking about death and dying, and it was talking about the story about my grandpa who has passed. Yes. Just over a year ago now, I guess, year and a half, and this whole piece came out so beautifully, and I had it workshopped, and when I first wrote it, I felt as though it was complete. That I was like, okay, this is what it is. This is what it is that I'm speaking to in this piece here.
Yes.
And then I left it, and I didn't read it for about 5 months. And then I came back to it, and I was like, oh, this is something else entirely now.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of gone through a couple iterations, and I can say in this moment in time it actually isn't complete. So I think that's a lot of times what happens with poetry. 100%. is that we have so many half-lived poems, lines or titles. Yes. Or sometimes we write a piece and we have to sit on it for a long time. And I think I'm starting to understand this process, where a lot of poets that I've learned from and listened to, in that sometimes it takes 3 years for a poem to become the poem that it's meant to be.
Poem, stories, everything. But
yes.
Go ahead, girl.
Whatever, and this can be translated to kind of any kind of artwork, right? Where it's just you could do a painting that you love in one moment, and then you could come back to that painting 3 months later and say, you know what, actually, I want to use a different color here, or I actually want to paint over it entirely, and I want to do something different, right? And so there is this relationship, is what's coming to my mind right now. This relationship that we have with our art. And I think that the more we begin to love the process and understand the practice, that we come into this relationship with pieces, right? And this kind of acceptance of, okay, this one idea we had here, because I think there's that sense of when we have an idea that lights us up, and as the creative vessels for something, we get so stuck on the vision of what we think it should be, right? Or what it's going to be. Yep.
That is true.
But part of that process is letting go of that practice, right? And saying, okay, this half-lived piece, I have a couple of lines, or, maybe I have this whole piece written, but there's something that's telling me that it's not quite ready yet. And trusting that and letting it almost take you on its own journey.
I love that.
You know, of like, okay, now that I've put this out on paper or canvas or whatever that is, right? Mm-hmm. How do I let this piece and the essence of what this piece is supposed to be take me on the journey of until it becomes complete or something entirely different too.
Honestly, I really love that. And I was like, I want to get Ash's take on this, because I had this question, because I'm like, does the piece, Kate, did I ever show you a yellow painting I did? Like,
I think you might have showed me that one. Yeah.
So it's funny when you said sometimes you could paint over something, have one picture and paint over it completely, because underneath that painting is like a whole mountain and like river thing I had going on. And then I remember sitting in my apartment when I was like living on my own and waking up one morning. I was like, I need a canvas. I don't have a canvas. This is going to be my new canvas. And I grabbed the painting. It was finished, quote unquote, right? Mm-hmm. And I just like, no, I painted over it completely. And the piece now that's on top, I love it. It feels complete. It feels holistic to where I'm at now versus the piece that was underneath, because I kept looking at it like it was not done. You know what I mean? Like it was done, but it felt like I need to add more. And I think sometimes we underestimate the value of starting something, just having at least like a basis, and then being able to use that and like not recycle like a way to just get rid of stuff, but like you can reuse it in a different way. Because I was listening to, what's her name? Joy Harjo. So I downloaded Masterclass, like the platform where you listen to different people. So I was listening to her Masterclass. Oh my goodness.
I've listened to that one too.
So good. Mm-hmm. So she was talking, and if people don't know who she is, Joy Harjo is a Native American poet. I think she's based in the U.S., I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. So there's something she said that I was like, I need to talk to Ash about this, because it's lining very well with what we're talking about right now. And she said, my way was not the way of most of the poets I was reading. I had to make peace with that, or I could have blocked my whole path. Girl. Just with what we're saying, I feel like sometimes we spend so much time on trying to fit what works or what is perfect or what the process others have gone through. And to your point earlier, because my mind's connecting it to that anyway in this moment, where it's like the simple things that are already around us, and I think sometimes we forget that the magic is already in us. And I've been guilty of this, I'm not gonna lie. I've been so guilty of this. When I started like writing, I was like, oh, I need to write like maybe Edgar Allan Poe, or you know, I forget his first name, I know his last name is Frost, or Angela
Robert Frost.
Yeah, like all those different like poets. I was like, I need to write like them and study them. And I had to learn. I remember God literally telling me, he said, why are you trying to be someone else? Because your magic comes from who you are. Like, you keep trying to write like them, but you have to write like you. And even when I was listening to her masterclass, I was like, oh my God. When she said that, I was like, I need to like capture that on paper, because for anyone who's listening, I don't know who this is for, but I'm gonna say it. The magic that you're trying to figure out how to get it done has nothing to do with the process of anyone else. You can study it, you can understand someone else's process so that you can internalize it to how it works for you, but don't try and mimic how they do it, because their mindset and where they're at, their experiences are completely different from you. Like I said, you can study someone, learn from them, and then see how what they did works for you, so you can garner the same success that you might be looking for. It's not about copying people. It's not about, you know, taking someone's work and saying, I'm going to do something exactly like that. It's just be inspired and allow that inspiration to literally light up your spirit, light up your mind, so you can create something authentic to you and something beautiful. You know what I'm saying? Okay, but yeah, I just wanted to, I was like, everything you're saying is reminding me of that. And I'm not done her masterclass, but it is amazing. Mm-hmm. I had to like pause and listen to a few like episodes multiple times, because it was inspiring me. So yeah,
I have to go back to my notes too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I feel like there is finding that balance. And I find that there's something to be said about how do we find the people who inspire our own gifts.
Yes.
And how do we, and I think that I've been learning about this a lot over these last couple of years in my own practice of learning so much about craft of poetry and voice and things like that. And there's something to be said about how do we kind of almost look for our mirrors. Because when I first started writing, I came to poetry very naturally, and I didn't know anything about structure. I didn't know anything about technique, really. It was just something that I was like, okay, this is just an art form that flows effortlessly through me. And I know that I feel the most alive when I'm writing in this kind of style, right? And so over the last year and a half, as I've been kind of gathering this wellspring of poetry and learning about different poets who write about all different kinds of things and have certain styles, and I've just been on this like explorative journey of buying so many different collections from poets that I might not have even heard of, or poets that have really inspired me from listening to them, or and things like that, right? And I think what's also helpful of finding this balance is, how do we, because as artists and I think as human beings, it's like we love to have that mirror in the world, right? We love to be able to read a poem about grief and say, wow, I know what that feels like.
Yes.
And then being able to kind of take that same experience and say, how would I tell it through my own experience? And so there is kind of that, it's like that feedback, or that mirror, I guess, is kind of the image that keeps coming to mind, right? It's like we need to be able to see those things mirrored out in the world as a way of also being able to understand our own experiences.
Yes.
Right? Where it's like, oh, I love that. Here are, 5 different ways that I've seen somebody write about grief.
Yes.
Right? And how do I place myself in between these spaces, right? Or find my voice as I'm being reflected back, other voices of artists that are really speaking to my own experience that's bringing something alive in me, right?
Yeah.
But then also trusting your own voice. And I think that's like so much of what you're speaking to too, right? Because I find that, there is practices in poetry that I've heard from a few different poets where when you're just getting started and you're trying to understand how somebody did something, the practice of actually like reciting and learning other work can be really powerful.
Yes. 100%.
Right? So it's like, oh, I love this piece by Mary Oliver, and I'm going to type it out on the page maybe more than once, and I'm going to just understand. I'm kind of going to get inside the poem in that way of like, what does it feel like to write this down?
Yeah.
And what aspects of this poem really speaks to me? And how do I then kind of carry that into my own experience, right? And because I think that too, and I still have this experience, right? And I think I still struggle with sometimes where you see an amazing piece and you're like, okay, I want to write something exactly like that. Right? Yep. So it's like using it as a mirror, but then also allowing that poem to reflect back to us, that it's like we as an artist can write that, not necessarily exactly how that's supposed to be.
Yes.
Right? But in our own way, right? And so it's finding that balance, right? It's like that balance of seeking out inspiration, because that's also what fills the wellspring. Yes. Right? When we see a painting, when we listen to a song, when we read a poem, all of those things breathe and experience back into us, right? And there's this infinite nature of creativity that exists as well too, right?
Yes.
Where we are all in some way taking pieces and parts of each other. And that is this kind of like this energy of creativity that exists here infinitely all of the time. Yes. Is that there is actually a thread happening all of the time where it's like, you'll paint something that'll inspire a poem in me.
Of course.
Right? I'll say something to you and you're like, oh, I have this amazing visual in my mind. where it's like you and I were talking about what does it, like the space between.
Oh, yes.
Question, right? And then you shared this like beautiful imagery about the ripple effect, right? And so like we are always in this exchange with each other, and I think that's also, to something that's so important to always remember, that it's like we by our very nature are creative.
Yes.
And that is always available to us, and we have that from within, and we also have that all around us, right? So that energy of creativity, when it's like you think about where we're sitting right now,
Yes.
and it's like someone made this table, somebody
That's
made
true.
these glasses, somebody built this house.
Yeah.
And so like when you kind of put that into perspective, it's like every single thing that we see that is, not of, I guess, the natural world, right? Was created by us.
Honestly, I love that, because even as you were talking right now, I'm like, I wonder if, because I know in scripture sometimes it says, not sometimes, somewhere, there we go, that's the right word, somewhere it says that we are all part of the body, right? And in this particular context, it's the body of Christ. And I remember having a conversation with God one day, and he was like, most of life is, the way you articulated it reminded me of this. I was like, we are all here for a particular function, and the beautiful thing, like you were saying, is that we get to share, and then in the process of sharing, I feel like that's how we start to remember our creative beings. You know what I mean? Because I used to struggle a lot feeling like, oh, I need to be a certain way, I need to do certain things. Even like with the poetry and the writing, most of my early work was just free verse poems. I had no idea what I was doing. It wasn't until later I started learning that I could literally see a type of poem and be like, oh my goodness, be inspired, and then write something like that. You know what I mean? So even in that space, when God was telling me, he's like, yeah, you are essentially, every day is you remembering who you are and making sure that the people around you, you love them unconditionally, and you're coming at not from a space where you're trying to compete with them, but just understanding that you are all part of the same ecosystem. We're all sharing the same earth, the same energy, you know what I mean? Like the same environment, that's the word. The same environment. So if as you're talking, I'm like, I wonder if that's what like it is meant when they say you're part of the body. Like, yes, the physical body can be described as like, everyone has fingers, so we're sharing in what we do together. The physical eyes, you could say, if you see something that I don't see, then I got your back or you got my backs, because we have different perspectives, and that's a beautiful thing. But I think sometimes we also forget that as creative beings, like, if God is true creator and we're creative beings, my perspective, it's just, why then suppress it or then compete or make people feel less than if we're all sharing the same house? You know what I mean? So it's just, I was like, wow, I'm just loving this conversation because it's just great. But go ahead, girl.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the truth of when we come into this space of loving awareness.
Yes.
Right? In the sense of kind of like the infinite flow of creativity and interconnectedness. Right? I think that when we start to see that, and so there's a story that's coming to mind that I've written about when you were sharing this kind of same context about, us in the body, right? And that we are each other, right? In some capacity, right? That there is a uniqueness to all of us. That is a beautiful thing, but we are each other, right? But we also are the earth. And I had this experience, Walt and I, my partner and I we road tripped to the West Coast in BC last summer. And there was this beautiful place called Woody's Lagoon that was super close to where we were staying.
Okay.
And it's this beautiful, like, kilometer stretch of a walking path that weaves through this lagoon area that's off the ocean where all of these blue herons nest. And it's just it's so beautiful. It's hard to describe. And then when you come out into the path, you come onto the beach and you come onto the ocean.
Yes.
And we had happened to be there during low tide. And so the thing that was really cool about this beach is that when the tide was low, it came out like 1.5 kilometers. So you could walk out into the ocean floor, and you could see all of the little sea creatures and all these little ecosystems. So there's these little pods where there was just like, there was seaweed and there was snails and there was all these little crabs that were like scurrying everywhere. And, you know, if you leaned over and they saw your shadow in the water, they'd immediately like, you know, hide and let's slowly like put their little claw out. And so, you know, we were walking around and just like experiencing all these little ecosystems. And as I was walking, I was also seeing these little pinholes in the sand. And after we'd kind of walked, you know, we were walking on the ocean floor, and then I came back and I was sitting on one of these washed up pieces of driftwood, and I was seeing this like steam rising from the ocean floor. Yeah. And there's probably some kind of like biological or like ecological explanation, you know, something scientific about this, right? But I'm looking at this through the lens of poetic thinking and feeling, right? And so I had this moment where I'm like, wow, everything here is breathing the same breath. And then I'm like watching like the earth breathe, right? It's like the way that like even the ocean, when the ocean moves back at low tide, there's a part of the earth that breathes. There's this entire ecosystem of creatures that can breathe, you know, that actually can be on land, and have this exhale kind of is how it felt to me, right? Where it's like the ocean was pulling itself back as if it was like exhaling. And I felt that deep interconnectedness of like, oh, like from, you know, the blue heron, right, to the trees, to all the creatures that were like, you know, in their tiny ecosystems at low tide. And I felt that same kind of exchange, right? And I think it's like when we come into this place, and this speaks a lot to the art of paying attention, it's when we cultivate a practice in our daily lives for presence, we start to see this. We start to come in conversation with life in a way where we see all of these interconnected things, right? We see that, oh, you know, we can sit on a beach and we can just pay attention to what's happening in that moment, and we can see all of the ways in which we're sharing a breath with all of these other creatures, you know, and each other, right? Where there's like, and that's kind of that infinite sense of how you and I keep coming back to this flow, right? Where it's like that exists in creativity, right? There's this energy that's like, that's the energy of connection, of how we are with each other, right? Where it's always flowing if we allow ourselves to be present enough to see and feel that, right?
I love that, honestly. And it's so true. What you shared reminds me of a moment where I used to take a lot of walks in the summer. We'll see if I do it in winter. There's no promises. But I used to take a lot of walks in the summer, and I remember I would just look up in the sky and just see like these beautiful, intricate like things in the clouds. I'm like, oh my God, that looks like a lion. That looks like, you know, a flower. It looks like something, you know. And I remember being with one of my friends. I was like, oh my goodness, the sky looks so beautiful. Do you see? I don't know if I saw an animal or something, but I just remember it looked beautiful. And I tapped them, I'm like, do you see that? And they're like, I don't. I'm like, and then in that moment, I guess I realized, I was like, you know, sometimes the things we see in nature, as much as we want others to experience them, sometimes they're gifts for you, and you just being able to share in the excitement and joy of you just embracing that beauty in the moment is a blessing to the people around you. Because even though like my friend was there, I'm sure maybe my face lighting up and just looking at the sky like, oh my goodness, probably changed how I was encountering with them, interacting with them. Or after that encounter, now when I interact with everyone else around me, I'm just totally lit up. You know what I mean? So even if we're the only ones who get to see those experiences, I feel like they are still such a blessing for others, because then it affects how we show up. Because trust and believe, when I would not go for walks and be indoors all summer, my body said, ma'am, go outside. Because I needed the sun. I needed the sun. And I could tell because my mood would just shift. And I remember just going to like the backyard in front of one of the trees. I was just like, I'm just gonna sit by the tree. And I remember just getting this sense of like the tree almost like just sharing with me. And I was like, huh, interesting. And I ended up seeing something online that said like trees and like dogs, because as humans, trees, dogs, we actually all have like energy, right? So I saw something online that said, you know, pets and nature is so generous, they will share their energy with you. Sometimes we're the ones, because sometimes we don't fully understand what the dynamic is in the energy or creative sense. We just take. You know what I mean? So that was just, yeah, that was an interesting thought that popped in my mind when you shared that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me think too about, I'm sure you and I have had a conversation like this before, or talked about this before. In that, also how we create spaciousness to be the creative channel. Right? Yes. So that's what a lot of what you're talking about is, how do we, I think that this, and it's, and it's not even necessarily for the act of creating itself. I think that you spoke to something super important about just how we are in the world.
Yes.
Right? And when we have these moments of awareness, or we can have these, we can have these conversations with ourselves to say, how do I shift the energy of my being in this moment? Right? And I know for me, and like you were saying too, it's like going on a walk, where I know that, walking has been a life-changing practice for me in the last couple of years. Yes. That sounds like a bold statement to say just for something that's as simple as walking. But we all know that experience in some capacity of, if we're feeling a type of way, right? Mm-hmm. If we're anxious, if we're angry, if we're, lost in our thoughts, and we allow ourselves to go outside.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be the act of walking, right? It's like, think about how you feel after spending 3 hours outside in the afternoon.
True.
Right? Whether that's whether that's in the sunshine during the summertime, or even just like out playing in the snow in the wintertime, right? True. It's that when we spend that time in nature, there's this clarity that we feel.
Yes.
Right? This clarity in mind and body, and there's this sense of peace that we come into. Mm-hmm. And I think that seeing nature as like therapy in that sense, right? Where it's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be for the act of creation.
Yes.
Right? Where, I know you and I have had this conversation before about how, so much of our suffering in the world right now is directly related to our own disconnect within ourselves, but I think our disconnect to our planet. The disconnect to the deep relationships that sustain all of our life here, right? And when we start to recognize this, and we start to walk on this path of, I think taking responsibility for who we are in the world, and the role that we all play. Yes. By way of our gifts, right? And I think that's, it's asking ourselves those questions. What can I do best to nurture this? Right? And so when I'm using myself as an example, it's like going for a walk, right? Is something that when I am feeling emotional, or I'm feeling blocked, or have some kind of inner conversation or problem that I need to work out with myself, right? It's like, okay, and I don't ever put any headphones in when I go for walks. And that's part of this practice of being present, right? It's allowing myself to be open and listening to what's happening around me, where I'm not distracted and my mind isn't pulled elsewhere. And of course, like, my mind is still pulled elsewhere. I'm not completely, fully in the present moment every single time I walked.
It's just more focused.
But I have kind of created this sense of openness around me. And so after the last, I would say, 3 years of doing this practice almost daily, we start to create this inner capacity within ourselves, right? And that could be, that can be through meditation, that can be through writing, that can be through, of any form of movement or anything that helps us shift energy, right? And I think that this is like, it's such a powerful practice of, you know, starting each day like that, or having those moments of check-in with ourselves, right? Where it's like, what do I need to do to shift the energy in my being today? How do I shift myself into a different state of being where I can be more present? And when we start having that conversation and we start carving out these pockets of space and time in our days, then it changes how we show up in the world. It changes how we are able to sit and have a conversation with somebody, how we're able to sit in, you know, in rush hour traffic, or sitting at a long line in a coffee shop where a new barista is just learning how to make a drink and people are getting frustrated, right? And we can sit and we can hold that space of presence.
Yes.
Because there is this practice that we've cultivated in the self to say, you know, how do we continually hold that frequency of pace?
Yeah.
You know, and of course, you know, it's not something that we can continually hold because we're human beings, and
It's a process.
And we have to allow ourselves to experience every emotion, right?
Yes.
But I think that I've been thinking about and sitting with this piece of wisdom from Eckhart Tolle for the last couple of weeks that I'm wanting to write something about. But he talks about the significance of people who are frequency holders.
Oof. Oof. Do you know the name of the book or the talk he did?
A New Earth is where this excerpt is from. So
Yes.
I had seen it from a writer on Substack had shared this piece, and I've been thinking about it for these last couple of weeks. And I think it's kind of tying into what I was just saying about how, you know, we're living in a time of such immense suffering in our world. I think that has always been true across our history. And I think that the dynamics and how that's changing is our exposure to that kind of suffering in a way that we don't know what to do with it. And it's so unfathomable to the point where it's hard to find where is our role. And I think that we're being asked collectively, what role do we play here? Because we all have a role, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this, the dynamics between active and passive roles. And that, you know, I think so much of what we're living through as a collective right now, we do need that actionable shift.
Yes.
Right? We do need the activism that we're seeing to really being able to shift the frequency, really, right? Of just like what has caused this level of suffering, right?
Yeah.
But not all of us are meant to hold that kind of role specifically. Right? And that when we think about passive, right, we can think of we can think of that as being complicit, right? Like I think we could think that as not acting. But there's something to be said, and this is such a new thought process that I'm just sharing here fresh because it's coming through me at the moment. But about holding this kind of spacious presence for healing to occur. Because as much as it's essential to have people who are boots on the ground protesting and, you know, forming movements and doing all of these really active things that are shifting energy, we also need people in those experiences who are holding the space for the healing.
Wow.
Who can have that kind of presence and that capacity for peace to be able to just hold the conversation, to just sit with people, to just listen. That's right? And that is very active in nature, right? But I think we have to also see the significance of that, right? Because I think there's a lot of conversations about that things need to be more active, right? We all need to be taking action. We all need to be shifting our energy here towards this, right?
Yeah.
Which is true. But also understanding the kinds of either moving energy or holding it. Right? Because that is what that sense of interconnectedness of how do we create this space together, right? Where we need the energy movers, the shifters, the people that come in and push, right? But we also need people who can hold the edges, hold the center, whatever that looks like, right? And so I'm just fully lit up in this thought process that's been moving through me lately. And I think that's so much of kind of circling back to a lot of things we talk about, right? Of like creating capacity to nurture our own energy so that we can hold this space for people. And then we also can hold that space for our art to be the channel for that, right?
Yeah.
Because that can still be part of that holding, right? Where it's like, how often have you seen a painting or listened to a song or read a poem that you felt held?
True.
Right?
Rare, to be honest. Very rare. I love the distinction you made because when you talk about people who are holders and people that are pushers, I feel like that goes back to something you kind of touched on. If my mind is connecting it, so we'll roll with it.
Yeah,
we'll roll with it.
It happened somewhere.
Yeah, it happened somewhere. But I think it's people really getting to know themselves in a way, because when you're talking about pushers and people who are able to hold the space, I feel like a lot of the times we rush and identify people as automatic pushers and automatic holders without giving them the space to tell you where they are at and who they are. And if someone is a holder, it's like, how dare you be a holder? You need to help us push, but it's like, what if I don't have the capacity to do that? What if I don't have the space and all I can do is hold? Will you then condemn me for this? You know? So it's such an interesting conversation, and I just love this conversation in general because I think it's something that needs to be said. And it even goes further to the idea of, do you have enough self-knowledge? Not in a sense of like you studying yourself meticulously, you try to read other books to change your personality. We're not talking about that. Like you're saying, are you holding enough space for yourself so that you can show up in other spaces? And if anyone listening to this is wondering, like, well, how does this apply to me? If I didn't say this before, I'll say it again. If not in this episode, maybe past episodes. But when we talk about creatives, it's not just about people in the artistic, fine arts, or humanities sector. I believe everyone is a creative in whatever shape, way, or form. In the same way an architect can help create the blueprint for the very building you might be living in or working in, that architect is using their creative essence to do that so that you can do whatever you have been doing in the workspace or the house space. And then guess what? After that, whoever got the blueprint is a construction team, and they have gifts in a different sphere, you know? So when you hear us talk about, poetic thinking and creative, don't automatically discount the information we're sharing just because it sounds like it's specifically for poets or artists or musicians or people in the fine arts sector. It's for everyone because everyone is a creator. So I will end the show with this, unless before I do that, I feel like I need to ask you, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up a little bit? I feel like it might be a little something you wanted to share before we...
So I think that the invitation that I would invite listeners into is to, I think about that question that we've kind of been circling around, or, this sense of how do I cultivate peace in my being?
I love that.
what do I need to do to nurture this sense of capacity within the self? And I think that it's, I think that what's really important to say too is that how do you create that space born out of a way of being or of slowness, right? Where I think that so often we get into this spiral of doing, right? If we have to read the books, we have to listen to the things, we have to watch this, we have to invest in this, we have to take this, right? All that holds value. But I think that, and I think even asking that question, right? I recognize that even asking that question of, what brings you back to that center of peace? That's a question that some of us might not even know how to answer because it's not something we've asked ourselves, right? And so I think the invitation is, what would it look like for you to slow down and to create a pocket of time in your day to be able to come into conversation with life. I always say going for a walk because I know that that's very much my practice, and I know that's not a practice that resonates for everybody. But I think as a curious exercise, if you will, of, because I know sometimes even just sitting and being with the self and being in silence is a really hard thing.
Yeah. That's true.
If it's not something that we've practiced, and I think like that takes time to be able to cultivate that kind of space within the self, right? And so walking is still kind of active where we can still get this sense of quietness, right? And so that would be my curious exercise is if you could create, whether that's 15 minutes, whether that's an hour, and, maybe this is something that you do for the next week. Let's make it like a weekly adventure of going for a walk, whether that's in your neighborhood or on a nature path that you love, without any headphones. Keeping your phone on you for safety.
Yes.
As I always say that I always have my phone on me for safety. But just going out and getting used to that feeling of what does it feel like to just be present? What does it feel like to not have the mind being pulled somewhere else from something external?
Yes.
Right? Of course, our thoughts are always going to take us there, right? They go somewhere else. But how do we practice this even for a short period of time? And just pay attention to it. Notice, how do you feel when you get back home? Journal about it if that's something that, if that's a practice for you, right? But I would invite you to take yourself on a week-long walking journey and to see what kind of space it creates within you, to see what kind of shifts happen in your being and your energy, and then keep following that.
Yes.
And see how it starts to create this wider space of presence and peace within yourself.
Yes. And I'll even just add and say, when we're talking about capacity, it's not just, don't think of it just, I'm like working on my emotional capacity. Capacity can be anywhere in your presence and your being where there's something that you need from yourself, right? So it could be spiritual capacity, whether you're someone that prays or whatever you do. There's that. There's emotional capacity. What that looks like for you, I don't know. Like she said, it could be journaling. I journal sometimes, but I'm more of like an artistic person. So whatever that looks like for you, challenge yourself. It doesn't have to be 15. If you feel like I only have 1 minute in a day or 5 minutes, you know what? Use those 5 minutes for something that you love to do that can help you almost get back to yourself. Like she suggested, if you want to go for a walk, go for a walk. That's honestly really great because walks are amazing. Don't get it twisted. They're great. I'm just not sure if I'll be walking this winter, but next summer, catch me outside for sure. So this is something to consider. And if you're still saying that I don't have enough time, think of what you can substitute that you already do during the day for that time you can make for yourself. If you usually, I don't know, this is me. If you usually get home and before bed or 2 hours before bed you watch a show, maybe the show inspires you, do you think that maybe for a week you can substitute, if the show is 40 minutes, watch 20 minutes of it and use that other 20 minutes for something that you may need from yourself, and then you can watch the show in increments? There is always solutions to the things we're trying to solve, so just something to think about. So before I end the show, I'm just going to end you with some warm words. And this is what I would say to you. There is so much more you will learn as you live out your life. The learning doesn't stop. So start now. Start the thing. Yes, that thing. That idea that you've been wanting to start. Starting could mean simply researching. Don't overthink it. The tools, you're researching the tools, the cost that you will need for this idea. But just start now. And plan as best as you can for the vision that you see in your head. So, thank you for joining us. I will link all of Ash's information in the bio. Her IG will be there if you're interested in joining her community. I will put the link in the show notes, not bio, guys, sorry, in the show notes. Thank you for joining us, and until next week, bye.